Here we go. The first PowerPoint I thought I was going to share with you was not that. We do want to go back to that from last night. I wasn't quite finished with last night's, but we needed to stop on account of time. And so I do want to go back to that. However, we need to get into some songs first. So that's what I want to maximize first. Here we go. And go back up to here, maybe. Okay, when we ended last week, it had somehow managed to make its way back to Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, and it helped us decode what's going on with the vineyard. The fact that the maiden has been out tending other people's vineyards, but her own vineyard, she has not been watching over. And so the comparison there is that out in the nations, those vineyards don't observe the Shemitah. They seek after power and authority, the tools of pride. These are the tools of Leviathan. These are the goals of Leviathan. They always want more power, they want more authority, and therefore they will use any available system, economic, military, religious, political, governmental, a healthcare system, you name it. If it's a system that affects a large number of people, then it's the habit of the beast, the offspring of the dragon, to try to use those systems to work within those systems to expand their power and their authority, we might say their thrones, because they're characterized by pride. And so to distinguish between Israel and the beast, we have to be humbled. We have to be taken into the wilderness, because the wilderness is specifically the location where he says he humbles us to see what's in our hearts. Because if we are humble, then we're able to cross back into the garden. Pride has no place in the garden. If he's cleansed the garden of prideful creatures, then why would he replant it with equally or worse prideful creatures? And so we learn this lesson not only through the weekly Shabbat, but we learn to relinquish what we think are our rights in the Shemitah year, when we turn loose of the things that we thought we owned, and we allow Adonai to use our land in order to nourish other people, not just us, he'll nourish us too, but to nourish not only people, but beasts. And this is a behavior that distinguishes the beast and the man. The beast will graze at any good time, any favorable time, whereas it's a man made in the image of Elohim who is willing to step back and relinquish his property in that 7th year, in the Shemitah year. It's a process of being humbled and letting go of things that everything inside of you is screaming, don't let go, don't let go. We won't be able to eat if you don't plow this field, if you don't harvest this field, if you don't pick this fruit. No, you're just like everybody else. In the Shemitah year, you can go out and you can pick exactly what you need, but you don't get to hoard up. You don't get to take it to market. You don't get baskets upon baskets full. You take in what is necessary for your needs, and you trust that it will be there. And that practice of learning to relinquish our rights to the land, we might say, is our garden practice, learning how to return to his vineyard instead of tending the vineyards of the nations. Ultimately understanding we don't own anything anyway. He owns the entire earth, and he lets us scamper around, believe that we own things, which from his point of view, I'm sure is laughable. So now we can plunge into the next verse, which is chapter 1, verse 7. And it's kind of long. And so I've just bullet pointed it to break it down. It says, "Tell me, O you whom my soul loves, where do you pasture your flock? Where do you make it lie down at noon? Why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions?" So it's a question. And this will be the last verse before we hear King Solomon answer, or before we can say Messiah will answer. So this is the maiden who's been out tending other people's vineyards. This is the maiden who's become swarthy or dark, out in the sun with nations of idolatry. So she's been burned by the sun worship. And so this is going to be her last question in this section before King Solomon or Messiah begins an answer. So tell me, O you whom my soul loves, where do you pasture your flock? Where do you make it lie down at noon? So there's two separate things right there. Well, there's two separate things in terms of the flock itself. The address, "O you whom my soul loves," opens up the question to two different groups. It can open up even in terms of speaking on behalf of. Who is the maiden speaking on behalf of? That can be a question. But where do you pasture your flock versus where do you make it lie down at noon? These are two very different conditions. So that's what we want to break apart here. So she starts out, she says, "Oh, tell me, oh, you whom my soul loves." And when we think about who we're commanded to love, it takes us back to the Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength." And we also know that there is a second commandment in the book of Leviticus that Yeshua says is like unto it. And on these two commandments is going to hang all the other commandments. Every commandment you keep is going to hinge upon the love that you have for the Father and the love that you have for your neighbor. And so the question could apply to the Father himself. Think of Moses as he's about to leave Egypt, and now he has inherited way more than the flocks of his father-in-law, Yitro. He has now inherited a flock of Israel and all the flocks within the flock of Israel. We have all these tribal flocks. And so as he's thinking about taking these incredible numbers of people across the wilderness, even if he thought we're just going from point A to point B, we're going from Egypt to the promised land, even if he's not envisioning 40 years in the wilderness, you still have a huge logistical question here. How are we going to tend these flocks, not just the flocks of the people, but the flocks of the people themselves, the people as a flock? How am I going to feed all them? Because even if we took water skins and I don't know, beef jerky or whatever, even if we took that, when you look at the mixed group of people, you're going to have women who are in various stages of pregnancy. You are going to have nursing children. You might even have disabled people among them, at least until they reach Mount Sinai. You might have old people who don't have good teeth, and so they might need soft foods. They might have a soft food requirement. When you think of caring for the flocks, not just herding the flocks and driving, there's a difference between driving a flock and nourishing a flock. And there's examples of both in scripture. when Jacob and Esau met, Esau is like, come on, let's drive these flocks and come on and join me. And Jacob points out to him, if I drive these flocks, these nursing children too hard in one day, I'll kill them. Just one hard day's journey in that climate could kill them. And so we have Esau, his way of looking at life is just drive them there. And yeah, you're going to have some losses, but still you'll get there. Jacob's point of view has been learned in exile, caring for his father-in-law's flocks that eventually became his flocks. But he told of the hardship that he encountered as a shepherd. And so he's developed a shepherd's heart. He's no longer the hunter. He's not a driver. Like Esau, he has a completely different heart for the sheep. And he says, how am I going to nourish? How am I going to care for the weakest among my flocks in order to reach where we are in our next destination, from where we are to our next destination? So there's drivers who pose as shepherds. They're going to fleece the flock, use the flock, drive the flock, use them for their own purposes, but they don't really nourish the flock. Moses is about to set off through a wilderness, even though at this point maybe he thinks it's going to be a very short journey. But he says, how am I going to nourish these flocks? How am I going to pasture them in the wilderness? What provisions are there for the weakest among this flock, for the nursing children, for the very pregnant mother, for the old person without any teeth? How am I going to feed them? I mean, we can't pack that much food. We can't pack that much water in order to survive this journey. At least the weakest among us. Maybe the strongest among us could reach the destination, but definitely not the weakest among us. And so kind of put the words into the mouth of Moses as he's poised to leave Egypt, and him asking the Holy One, tell me, oh, you whom my soul loves, how am I going to pasture these sheep on this journey? How am I going to nourish them and take care of them? Because remember, last night we read the passage in Revelation where it talked about the woman being taken to her place and being nourished for a time and times and half a time. And that's basically 3.5 beats. If you say pa'am, it's time. If you say pa'amim, it's times. It means 2. And then if you say half a time, it's going to be half a pa'am time. So by not giving us a specific time frame, but just saying a time, a times, and half a time, we might make that days. And in certain times when that prophecy is fulfilled, maybe we'll make that years. When there's times, prophecy cycles around, as we've seen. So maybe a time and times and half a time can be 3.5 years. In some cases, maybe it's 3.5 days. At any rate, what we have here is this question: how am I going to take care of this flock? How am I going to nourish them in the wilderness, away from the presence of the serpent? Because at this point, as he's poised to leave, the dragon's still out there. The crocodile of the Nile is still slithering around. Maybe not quite recovered from the death of the firstborn, but he's still out there. And so there is still a presence of the serpent in Egypt. And so Moses is about to take them out, away from the presence of the serpent. And his concern is, how will I nourish them? How will I pasture this flock on this journey? And so he's taken on this flock because he does have a love for Adonai. But by taking on this flock, he's telling us that he has as well a strong love for Israel, for his own people. So the 2 points of the Shema, to love Adonai with all your heart, soul, and strength, and then to love your neighbor as yourself. Moses is exhibiting both of these. And he's concerned about the journey. But we saw even farther back that he did love his brothers. Even though he had been brought up separately from them, nevertheless, he still loved his brothers. That was where his loyalty lay. Because in Exodus 2:11 through 15, we read about when there's an Egyptian taskmaster oppressing his Israelite brothers, Moses strikes out and he strikes down the Egyptian. So he risks his own life, in essence, gives up his life for the sake of his brothers, who maybe he's never even met before. Maybe he doesn't even know who they are. They're just random Israelites. Of course, they do have an identity. Datan and Aviram, they're thought to have been Datan and Aviram, that he comes back later and they're quarreling and they say, who are you? You know, like, we can snitch you out, Moses. And that's when he knows he has to leave. So even though he loved his nation, they don't always return that love. But we can see at each point that his love for the nation is stronger than his love for Egypt. And that's important if you're going to pasture a flock. And so here's the question we want to dissect. Where do you pasture your flock? And where do you make it lie down at noon? Because they're thought to be two different places. If you're trying to nourish a flock, you're pasturing it. But when you make it to lie down, you're activating one of those words. Remember, we said there's certain words we can hear that we associate with resurrection. So if we hear something like arise or go up or awaken, those can be hint words that there is something about resurrection that's being presented in that context. And so when we see where do you make it lie down at noon, lying down, I mean, it can simply mean lying down to sleep or rest, but it can also hint to death, like a state of virtual death. So we have the pasturing of the flock first. Now, whether you're nourishing, you're feeding the flock. It's thought to be the equivalent of the Israelite governments that did succeed Moses after his death. There's that versus the lying down of the flocks at noon. And at noontime is when you have the most oppressive heat, especially, the Middle East where we're talking about. The heat at noontime, it becomes oppressive and it pretty much drives people and animals into the shade, and they just rest, they'll nap, take a siesta until the sun starts to drop in the late afternoon, so that you can go back out and you can work in those afternoon, evening hours without dying of a sunstroke. And so the understanding here is if I make the flocks to lie down at noon, it's because the heat is so oppressive that it's really impossible for them to do much more than just rest. They're in a suspended state of suspended animation almost once it reaches noontime. So not as productive. And so this explains the connection here with why the maiden is trying to explain her swarthiness when she says, don't stare at me because I'm black. The sun has burned me, and here's my story. This is how I got sunburned. And so this principle of the sunburn being in contact with the idolatrous nations, because remember, the sun represents, it's like the umbrella over all the gods and goddesses of the world. And so she's been out there mixing among that in the nations. And that's how she's explaining herself. And so the lying down of the flocks at noon in the oppressive heat is thought to represent the exile, the noontime heat would represent the exile. And therefore, that lying down is thought to be part of the exile, being out among the foreign governments, where she became swarthy when she got damaged by the sun. She got her sunburn. And again, the heat of noonday is brought up. So two different situations. A flock that would be pastured in their own pasture, Israel, the promised land, and then flocks that would be out there among the nations being made to lie down in the oppressive heat of exile because of the oppressive heat of idolatry that does exist out there among the nations. So, noontime, Sohoraim. It's not the easiest word to say in Hebrew. Like if you wanted to say lunchtime or lunch, it's based on noon, Sohoraim. So, like, I'm trying to think of an example of something. Escape me here for a second, but like, here's one: Oruchat, Sohoraim, like lunchtime. And it typically is afternoon in Israel, by the way. If you live in Israel, noon, about 1:30 is lunchtime. And then people kind of disappear for a while, and especially in the summertime. You might see shops closed down during the heat of the day, and then they'll open back up in the evening, and they'll pretty much party till midnight and after, because that's when it's cool enough to do anything. But Sohoraim is noon, and it's from the root Sohar. Sohar. I don't recommend the Kabbalah to the average student. If you go to school, if you have to take classes, you're going to run into it eventually. But just for the average beginner learning what's what, I don't recommend the Zohar. It's a Kabbalistic work, and it would be a distraction to you. But Zohar, since so many people have heard the name of the book, it means light, or you may have heard Zohar, but it's Zohar, light. And you have to be careful with lights. What's the source of the light? And that's why I really don't recommend you get into it without, a really good reason, especially if you're a beginner, because you can be seduced away from the things that are good, that are perfect, that are sure, that are foundational. The first mention of Zohar is going to be in the ark. And when Noah's being shown the plans for how to build the ark for a day of darkness, he is told to make a window, a Zohar, for the ark. And it says, finish it to a cubit from the top and set the door of the ark inside of it. In the side of it, you shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. So if we think of Zohar, light, Sohoraim is going to mean two lights. Just like, remember I said Pa'am is a time. Pa'amim is two times. Elef, I'm trying to think of good examples. Elef is 1,000. Alpine, I'll harden the F sound to a P sound. Alpine is 2,000. So what is the year? We are in the year Alpine ve'esrim. No, esrim ve'achat, 2021. So you can see how when the word is given a simple im suffix, often it's telling you there's two of them. So Aleph, 1,000, Alpaim, 2,000. Sohar, noon or light. Sohoraim, two lights. And I'm not sure why that's used for noon. Maybe it's alluding to like the morning light before the sun reaches its zenith, as well as the afternoon light, the light before and the light after it reaches the zenith. Possibly that's what it's all about. At any rate, at the time of Sohoraim or noon, that's when you would tend to lie down to seek shelter from the sun, because it's really vicious. So with this first mention of Sohar, we get the idea that, okay, Noah, these animals, I'm going to protect them with you. And you're going to be in a type of exile because I'm going to remove you in a way from the earth. I'm going to bring you into a place of protection, but I need to remove you from the like physical ground itself. So you'll be elevated by the water. And so this is going to be a period, it's going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. During this period, it's like a period when the animals are lying down. They can't get out and pasture. They can't get out and graze. So because of the severity of the time, I think this is why it's connecting it with Sohar, the window, the light, that it's going to be a time of oppression. So let's look at the next two mentions. And they have something in common. They're coming, both of them, from Genesis chapter 43, but the first one is verse 16 and the second one is verse 25. And the context of this is the reconciliation of the 12 tribes in Egypt. So verse 16 says, when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to his house steward, bring the men into the house and slay an animal and make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon, Sohoraim. And then in verse 25, it says, so they prepared the present for Joseph's coming at noon, but Sohoraim, for they had heard that they were to eat a meal there. So the context is tribal reunion. The 12 brothers are going to be together here. There's going to be a reconciliation, and the reconciliation occurs at the point when the sun is at its highest heat, when the sun is its most oppressive, when it's at its most damaging, especially to the weak or the sick or the young. But Sohoraim is when this meeting of reconciliation takes place. It takes place over a meal. So this is the time when the two flocks are lying down. And notice it says Joseph saw Benjamin with them. We know that Benjamin is kind of subsumed into the tribe of Judah, which would comprise, I don't think we really call them southern tribes, but the tribe of Judah would be Judah and Benjamin for the most part. Not 100%, because remember, there's a remnant of the other tribes within them. The 10 northern tribes, we might refer to them as Israel. We might refer to them as Ephraim. We might refer to them as the house of Joseph. And so at this time of reconciliation, and here Judah is going to be the go-between between Joseph and Benjamin. And it says when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he says we need to make a meal ready at noon, but Sohoraim, because does he intend to reveal himself? We're not for sure, but he does intend for something to happen, but Sohoraim, at noon, when the oppression is at its worst. And I'm sure for Benjamin and Judah, especially out of the brothers, Sohoraim was going to be the worst. It had the potential to be the best, but it could actually be the worst. And maybe that's why we're getting HaShirim. It's noon has become two lights. There's this light of expectation of something good, like, oh, great, we're going to get to have a meal with Pharaoh's first in command. And then, if you think about the issue with the silver cup, with the divining cup, like it could be the worst day ever. We could go from the best day ever to the worst day ever at high noon. That's when there's always a showdown, right? High noon at the OK Corral or something. It's a showdown. And it's seen as a time when the two flocks are lying down, when Judah and Joseph are lying down. They're not elevated spiritually at that time. They're like in that state of suspended animation, like a flock would be at that time of day. They're in a state of virtual death. They're in a holding pattern. And so the reconciliation between these brothers, where they're going to sit down and eat this meal together, it's taking place in exile. It's taking place in Egypt, which can represent the nations. It's even taking place, if we want to extend it, in the presence of the serpent. They're in Egypt. They're in Dragonland. They're in crocodile territory. And remember what it says when Joseph cried out, that the cry was heard all the way to Pharaoh's house. I don't know how far apart they lived, but for one person to cry out in one building and that cry to be heard in a palace, who knows how far away from there, it tells you that there was a spiritual element to Joseph's cry at the time of their reconciliation. So that may account for why noon is seen as a double light, like a turning point, that the morning light is about to turn into that more oppressive light. And even though there is going to be a reconciliation, there's also going to be an exile that would follow when the Pharaoh rises that doesn't know Joseph. And so she asks, once she asks the question about the government of the flock within its own pasture, Israel, and then she asks about the flocks lying down at noon, the flocks of exile. She asks this question. She says, "For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions?" And chaver, most of us know this Hebrew word. It's a pretty common Hebrew word. If we say chaverim, it's brothers, friends. Chavera, it would be a female friend. But it can also mean united as one person. And an example of that would be in Judges 20, verse 11, where it's translated into English as companions, that chaverim is translated as they were united as one man. So it's not just a casual friend, it's not just a Facebook contact. It's a person with whom you can be united as one man, spiritually. And so the one who has the flocks has companions. He has people who can be united. And maybe this is why, as we look at the example of the HaShirim, in the context of Joseph, and how this incident, this meal at noon, HaShirim, it's bringing the tribes together. And we know that Joseph even had the presence of mind to seat them in birth order. He sorted through them. And they were kind of wondering, like, how does he know, what our birth order is? But he does. I guess they had, little seating cards or something with their names written on it. I don't know. But the companions, the implication there is they are one united group, one man. And so she asks, as the one who has been separated, the one who has been out in the vineyards of the nations, who's been sunburned, she says, why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions, your flocks who are united in their identity. And also another translation of veiling herself, you could also say turns aside. For why should I be like one who turns aside beside the flocks of your companions? In other words, there's the good flocks, the united flock. They might be flocks, but they are nevertheless a flock. And she said, why should I be separated from them? Why should I turn aside from them? Why should my identity be concealed by the veil? That I'm actually part of this flock of your companions. My flocks that I'm bringing in from the nations, these are going to be part of the flocks of your companions. It's going to be one sheep, one sheep. It's going to be one flock with one shepherd, which is how Yeshua described it. At any rate, she is one who has veiled herself or turned aside. And Leviticus 13:45 gives us an example of why a person might wear a veil and might also turn aside from the companions of Adonai. It says a leper must wear a veil, cloaking his face up to his lips. And he cries out, remember, unclean, unclean. In other words, if you're trying to maintain ritual purity in order to go worship in the tabernacle or the temple, then you avoid somebody like this. And so there's all sorts of irony right now because we're all veiled if we go out in public. It's like the whole world is unclean. But that veil, he pulls up the veil and covers the lips, the mustache area as a leper, because the leper is considered a living dead person. He's dead already. Remember when they're interceding for Miriam when she was struck with leprosy? They said, let her not be like one born dead. Because that's the implication. Because you were stuck in your uncleanness, you are separated from the community. You have to turn aside from the community, and you can't lie down among the flocks of the companions. And so if we think of the flocks being out there in the exile, where they're being sunburned, these are the noontime flocks. They are also going to be tainted with uncleanness from their idols. And to different degrees, they're going to absorb that uncleanness. The word has always been an antidote. And to the extent that you try to walk in the word, because there's a purity there, there's a washing in water by the word, there's a purification by fire of the word, then the less the uncleanness of the nations can stick to you. Think of, how we used Leviathan's scales, the crocodile scales. We said that it's like they had a magnetic quality to them that caused other fish to stick to their scales. And that's how Pharaoh drew in his armies with him into the Red Sea. They stuck to his scales. It's like they're little magnets. It's the same thing. If you're walking in the word, and we're not talking about the words you don't understand, we're talking about the words you do understand. If you will walk in faith in that word, the magnetic quality of uncleanness is reduced, because where there are unclean things, it tends to multiply unclean things. For instance, if there's a dead possum in the road, then don't even give it an hour. Give it 30 minutes. and you'll look out there and you'll see half a dozen vultures, more unclean things. We go from an unclean animal, a dead possum in the road, to half a dozen, what does it call them? Unclean and hateful birds in the book of Revelation. Unclean attracts unclean. Death attracts uncleanness. Once uncleanness is attracted to something, then Yeshua's instruction said, if you drive out an unclean spirit, it'll go into the dry places and then it'll return with 7 things more evil than itself. It's going to go back where it had its original home. It can be swept clean, but see, if it's not been furnished with the word, if there's still room to move in there. See, the word makes it just impossible for unclean things and evil things to move in and take up residence. It's an unfavorable environment for them. But if all you did was drive out the unclean thing, but then you never immersed yourself into the word, then that unclean thing could find its way back, plus bring 7 things more evil than itself. And so that's the danger out there in the exile. And that's also the beauty. Because out in the exile, look at the gift of the word. That, I mean, it went through a historical growth period, but now there's very few places on earth where you're going to die for having a Bible. You might be put in prison in a few places, but for the most part, it won't kill you. You'll have easy access to a Bible. You can go online and read a Bible. If you have a phone, if you have a cell phone, you can read a Bible. And so that cleansing water has been available even out there in the noonday of the exile, in the heat of the sun worship of the exile. Nevertheless, as the time of exile has increased, the availability of the word has also increased. Nevertheless, there's a tainting that occurs. If we're in Babylon, even though we're not of Babylon, we're trapped within their systems. We are trying to navigate our lives knowing what kingdom we're actually a part of. And then whatever government we live under is secondary to the King of Kings, his kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. And so the more we immerse in that word, the less likelihood that we're creating those magnets for uncleanness out in these places of our exile. And so we don't want to be like the leper who receives this mark called tsarat, or leprosy, and then he gets put outside the camp and he has to identify himself as being unclean. Don't get close to me if you're going to the temple. So she's saying, why should I be like that? Why should I be like a leper? Because she says, why should I have to be like one who is beside the flocks of your companions, not within the flocks? See, the shepherd walks with the flock. And she says, why should there be this degree of separation? Why can't I be within the flocks of your companions? I don't want that identity. So here's a passage from the Midrash that I think sheds some light on it. She's saying, I request that I should not be like a shepherd into whose flock wolves entered and tore it apart. And he cloaks himself up in his garment and leaves. Similar to what is stated, he, referring to Nebuchadnezzar, will envelop the land of Egypt, which will be left desolate as a shepherd who wraps himself in a garment and leaves there in peace. And that's from Jeremiah 43:12. They say this means the Egyptians could not stop Nebuchadnezzar from plundering. And so that's why Nebuchadnezzar was able to leave Egypt in peace. They were powerless to prevent him. Another view is that when Nebuchadnezzar enveloped the land of Egypt, he so completely despoiled it and emptied it out that Egypt was like a shepherd whose flock was decimated. So Pharaoh kind of wrapped himself in his garment, left in peace, feeling very fortunate to have escaped in peace with his life and with his garments. And so the comparison is being made there, where the maiden is saying, I don't want that. I don't want to be that kind of shepherd. I don't want to be the shepherd of that kind of flock. I don't want to be that kind of shepherd. I don't want to be the shepherd of that kind of flock. That is just so despoiled, so decimated, so defeated, that I should be happy that I just escaped with my life in my garment. And I don't remember where it is. It's somewhere in the New Testament. It talks about, people who are being saved. And nevertheless, it says, for some, it's going to be an escape as though by fire. In other words, it's going to be, some smoke clinging to them in their salvation, because they really cut it close. They were so embroiled in this noonday exile and loved the Son so much, salvation for them is going to be a difficult thing. But now we have an answer. So King Solomon is going to answer. Remember, he's the writer of the song. And he may be speaking on behalf of Messiah at this point. He says, if you yourself do not know, most beautiful among women, go forth on the trail of the flock and pasture your young goats by the tents of the shepherds. And that's verse 8. So she's asked the question, and let's review her question so we remember what's the original question. Tell me, O you whom my soul loves, where do you pasture your flock? Where do you make it lie down at noon? She's asking about pretty much the fate of the flocks of Israel, either within their own land or within the lands of their exile. And then she asks her, why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? So now here's the answer. If you yourself do not know, most beautiful among women, go forth on the trail of the flock and pasture your young goats by the tents of the shepherds. And again, it's very easy to put these words into the context of the Exodus, because that's what we know is the most beautiful among women, Israel. They're about to leave Egypt, and they're about to go on the trail of the flock. And they're going to live in tents. They don't know it at that point, but for 40 years, they are going to live in tents. But the way that they came into Egypt, remember when Joseph is selling the immigration policy to Pharaoh, he points out that his family are shepherds. They've always been shepherds, and that's all they want to be is shepherds. Because I'm sure at that point, the Israelite boys had something of a reputation as warriors. Shimon and Levi set some stuff in motion. And so it sounds like the surrounding countries did have a healthy fear of Jacob and his sons, that their reputation as warriors had possibly surpassed their reputation as shepherds. So Joseph has to assure Pharaoh they're shepherds. And then when he brings them in to meet Pharaoh, he says, say you're shepherds. Do not identify yourself as warriors, because later that's going to be the concern, is that Israel might take up arms against Egypt itself. And so they started dealing craftily with them. So the trail of the flocks, we have a nation of shepherds, And so it's going to be the trail of the flocks. And it's going to allude to the exodus from Egypt through the wilderness. And so for 40 years in the wilderness, we would have the tents of the shepherds. And so this maiden is being told by King Solomon, go and look for the tracks, look for the trail of the flocks in the wilderness. Because if you will go into the wilderness and follow those stations in the wilderness, if you will look at the miracles that occurred in the wilderness, then, young lady, you are going to have the answer to your questions. Because there is so much prophecy that occurs in the wilderness that overlays into succeeding times of prophecy. So much so that when we get into the book of Revelation, we're given that intersection we looked at last night, where the woman is taken into the wilderness to be nourished for a time and times and half a time on the wings of a great eagle. And then in our Torah portion, Yitro, he says, you saw how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. He brought them right there in the wilderness to Mount Sinai to give them the words of the covenant. And that's not the only correlation. If you want to understand the 144,000 in the book of Revelation, then you have to understand the specific incident that happens with the Moabite and the Midianite women. That was a wilderness test, and there has to be a rectification of that. And so it's I would say a primary prophecy. If you want to understand 144,000, then you have to go back to that Torah portion. And any Torah portion that deals with the after effects of the idolatry with Baal Peor and the Moabite / Midianites, because that same force is part of the dynamics in the book of Revelation. And that's why we see these 144,000 being raised up specifically as an army. They're going to be able to do battle, and that's the connection to the Torah portion. They had to raise up a certain number from each tribe in order to go out and do battle. And so that's just one example. If you want to know why, young lady, you have been out there in the other vineyards, why you've been out in the noonday flocks, then go back to the wilderness and follow the trail of the flocks. And the events, the prophecies that occurred in the wilderness are going to explain to you your own journey. And you're going to have the answers to your questions. But the manna particularly is going to be the one thing that the Midrash emphasizes in looking for the trail of the flocks. The manna is like the focal point of their commentary. They go on and on and on about the manna. And they say this is the real evidence of Hashem's ability to pasture and to nourish his flocks, even in the wilderness. So, one of the miracles that happened before the manna fell was that for 31 days after they left Egypt, they were still eating unleavened bread. And so I ask people, or people ask me, like, how should I prepare for the events ahead? I would say have provisions that will last 31 days. Because after that, the manna starts falling. But in this case, it looks as though the bread they took away somehow just kept multiplying, because they took the dough on their kneading boards, they loaded it on their backs, and they left with it. But not through any stretch of the imagination would a ball of dough last your family for 31 days. But miraculously in the wilderness, it did. And then from 31 days onward, then they depend upon the manna. This is going to be the primary evidence on the trail of the flocks. So Exodus 16:1 says, then they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether or not they will walk in my instruction. And that's it right there in a nutshell. If you go on the trail of the flocks, you say, what can I learn on the trail of the flocks about myself? He says, I'm going to give you instructions. I'm going to put you out there in the wilderness. You're not going to be held by the realm of death anymore. You can consider yourself saved from the realm of death, but it doesn't mean you've entered into the garden either. It doesn't mean that you've experienced a full restoration to your former state. He says, I have to test you first to see if you can even exist in the garden, or whether you're just going to tumble back out, which there's a mental image, people trying to get into the garden and just tumbling back out. But he says, I have to test them to see if they will walk in my instruction. And I'm going to promise you a day's portion every day, twice as much on the sixth day. And if that's enough, remember our lesson about the Shemitah last week, if that's enough for you, then you can probably function in my garden as well. And then it says, so it came about in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the layer of dew evaporated, behold, on the surface of the wilderness, there was a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. There's manna. And so for the rest of the journey, until they eat from the produce of Canaan, they are going to live on manna. So the primary test in the wilderness is manna. And it's the bread of heaven. It's his instructions. So no matter where you are, you might say, hey, I'm pretty sure I'm out in the noonday right now. I'm pretty sure I'm not back in the garden. And so I'm out here with these flocks that are lying down. They're in a state of suspended animation. And so why should I be like one of those flocks? Why should I be like a shepherd of one of those flocks? Why should I be like one who is turned aside? I want to pasture in the land, but not just the land. I want to pasture into that spiritually elevated land that hovers just above the land of Israel. Because see, there were people who were lost and equally as lost in Israel as Israel is lost among the nations. And that's the lesson of the third beast, which is Greece. With Babylon, there was deportation. Persia, Media, they still lived in a state of exile. With Rome, they were exiled, but it was Greece who caused the greatest disruption within the land of Israel itself. So even the flock within the land, there was a disruption. There was a confusion. There was an assimilation. There was an absorbing of Greek mindset. He said, I'm bringing you into the wilderness. I want to see whether you're going to walk in my manna, whether you're going to walk in my instruction. It's a test. So, I guess we'll stop there. And I did want to, using that, go back to last night. Not you. You. Yes, you. Okay. Yeah, that's what we started with last night, was the intersection between being nourished in the wilderness for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And so there's this intersection in the same way that the Israelites were brought on the wings of an eagle to be nourished in the wilderness on manna, so that they would learn that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. You see that exact scenario in Revelation 12:13. When the dragon saw that he's thrown down to earth, he's going to start persecuting the woman who gave birth to the male child. The two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. But this is what I was saying last night, explains Yeshua's 40 days in the wilderness, being hungry, being thirsty, experiencing that humility that's going to carry him to his death and resurrection. And his temptations, primarily like, turn these stones into bread. If you want all the kingdoms of the earth, bow down and worship me. Just jump off of this and see if he'll send his angels to catch you. These were the things that the Israelites had trouble with. They struggled with in the wilderness, even though he was going to nourish them. They had to be hungry. They had to be thirsty in order for that humility of trust to set in, that said, okay, even though I'm hungry and I'm thirsty, what if they had gone to Moses and said, Moses, we're hungry and we're thirsty. Can you guide us on how to pray? Can we join you in prayer? Can we cry out in prayer instead of complaining that we're not getting it the way we're used to receiving it, that we're not getting our check in the mailbox, that we're not getting our direct deposit, that it's not in the grocery store anymore to even be purchased? You know, we like the old way, Moses. I mean, it was just easier that way. But you're asking us to trust Adonai. And that humbles us. Remember, we said in last week's lesson, I quoted Rabbi Lux, it says there is nothing so humbling as letting go, relinquishing control over something. And that's what the wilderness does for us. It teaches us to relinquish control to the Father. That's what humbles us. And then that's what prepares us to be able to cross over into the land and to learn how to eat of the yield of the land of Canaan. Because see, if we can be humble in the wilderness, he can trust us with his Shemitah years in the land itself. If he can trust us as a noonday flock out there among the nations, then he can bring us back into the land. Why should we be veiled beside the flocks of his companions? Why can we not be united and become his companions in the land? And that's what we see in the wilderness. If we're going on the trail of the flock, then we're going on a tour journey of losing control. Moses had to fast 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain to receive the Torah. He lost control of his food and his water. But what did he receive in return? What man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And he's teaching us how to cling to him instead of to our paycheck, our retirement check. He wants to be our insurance policy. And I'm not telling you to do away with those things. I'm telling you to put them in perspective. If he starts kicking those things away from you, then it's in order to let you know how close he is to you in the wilderness. You don't realize it, but you're riding on his eagle's wings. You're riding on his wings when that happens, which is a pretty cool thing. And so that's why I used Matthew 4, 1 through 11 last night, because it details the 3 temptations, learning how to depend upon the word, bringing down your pride, which is bringing down Leviathan, refusing to live in the kingdom of Leviathan and his beast kingdoms, and saying, like Yeshua said, it's written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. And I looked that up in Matthew, in the Hebrew version, and a couple of things stuck out. I guess I can minimize that. I remember last night, if you've had time to watch the recording, and I think we talked about it the week before, how the fleeing serpent or the piercing serpent, that description was barach. And we looked at it again last night. It can not only mean to flee, it can mean to be driven away. Okay, now think of Nachash, serpent, has the same gematria value as Mashiach, Messiah. So in the Hebrew Matthew, it's way more evident what happens. In English, it'll say, let's see, this is what happens when I don't have my glasses. Okay. Then Jesus was taken by the Holy Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. In Hebrew, it says, as Lokeach Yeshua Baruch. Basically, he's going to be driven into the wilderness. You're getting that snake thing, how you can see that everything Yeshua is doing is overturning the kingdom of the snake. That the Messiah is going to cancel out the effect of the snake. But yeah, being taken out, Lamidbar, to the wilderness. And then later, and when Yeshua is answering, what do you say? Where I think our English translations usually say, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God only, and him alone you shall serve. The language that's used here in the Hebrew Matthew is, then Yeshua answered him, go Satan, that is Satanas, for it is written, I will pray to the Lord, and him only you will serve. So it's a slight difference. I will pray to the Lord, and him only will you serve. Which makes sense in the context of the trail of the flocks, because rather than praying to the Lord in their situations of hunger or thirst, they complain to Moses. And he's saying that's not the way you navigate through the wilderness. You navigate through the Midbar by praying to Adonai, and him only shall you serve, rather than seeking that intermediary. So let's see, let's stop the recording.